Hi students, let's do a part 2 on nonverbal communication styles. Okay, so let's start with touch. Okay, so we talked about space last time and kind of how there were different spaces of space. There are also different ones of touch. Okay, so people can use touch to try to communicate things either with what they're saying or not with what they're saying. Okay, so there are kind of 5 different types of touch that we have. The one that's kind of easiest for me to talk about actually is the control one. So I think about when my kids were little and we would go into a store, like a shop, and they'd have a bunch of glass. And I would kind of put my hand on the back of my kid's neck, just kind of hold onto their neck just a little bit in a way of saying like, hey, stay right here by me, right? Or maybe holding their hand to bring them with me. It can get closer to violence, right? Like you could be pulling someone's ear or something else. But in terms of trying to get people to do what we want to do, we often can use touch. And I never had to say anything to my kids. They knew as soon as I sort of like put my hand on the back of their neck that I wanted them to stay right with me. Okay? And that I was trying to like control sort of their behavior without ever saying that, right? So we have some other ways of touch, right? So we have affect and playfulness. I often think about those two as like if you're in a bar and you're wanting to like flirt with someone, there are a couple of different ways we do that. So we might playfully like punch them in the shoulder, or we might with affect, right? You might put your hand on somebody's arm and sort of stroke their arm a little bit. And those are things that we can give information for what we're trying to communicate, right? So a touch can actually say a lot. Then we have ritual and task related. So ritual, we think about things like handshaking, right? Waving hello, waving goodbye. Task related, things like the physician taking our pulse or our blood pressure or listening to our heart, those types of things. Okay. Now we have a bunch of cultural variations on contact in terms of who can do it, where you can do it, how long you can do it. And this touch can vary by culture. Probably the most familiar that you guys might be with is with Islamic culture and sort of the lack of touch between males and females, especially if they don't know one another. So we're not talking like brothers and sisters or husbands and wives, but in a business type setting, right? You may not extend your hand if you're a male to shake females' hands. You probably wouldn't have hugging quite the same. So in these types of situations, it can be difficult to decide what to do. So I had a situation a few years ago where we had a number of visitors to the university who all came from Middle Eastern countries. So my assumption, not knowing, right, I had to make a decision, was that probably most of the people traveling would be Muslim. But I wasn't 100% sure. And while I knew that as a man, you probably shouldn't touch a Muslim woman, I wasn't sure what the rules were for a Muslim man and a non-Muslim woman. So when I was meeting these individuals, I was there with my boss, who was male, so a male and a female. And I watched for the men to give me their clue. So as the men in the party extended their hand to me, then I knew that meant it was okay for me to shake their hands. And then I didn't really feel that it was a problem for me to shake women's hands. But as I watched my boss, he'd shaken all these men's hand, and then he kept his hand out for the women that were coming into the room. And it made sort of this awkward moment, right? Of like, ooh, we don't really want to disrespect you, but we also don't really want to touch you. And so it can be kind of different from culture to culture, okay? And then there might be other times like, so I'm not really a hugger, but there are lots of sort of cultural things where you might hug, like a wedding, sometimes seeing a friend that I haven't seen for a long time. But I'm not someone who like has to hug my friends every time that we see them. That would be kind of unusual for me, but that's more personal than it is cultural. Okay, let's talk about time. So time in terms of how it relates to nonverbal communication, I hope that will be clear in just a minute. So as we talk about time, you have to understand that there are different ways people interpret time, okay? So, and I mentioned this just a little bit in verbal communication, But basically, different cultures can be oriented to different ideas of time. Okay, so we have present, past, and future oriented. And we have also kind of the way we discuss those things can be different depending on our orientation. Okay, so past oriented, we're focused in tradition and the wisdom of the elders. Present oriented, we're looking at things that are happening right now being the most important. And future oriented, the idea is that saving for the future or tomorrow, is kind of the most important. Okay. So the reason why this plays a role in nonverbal communication is because there's an underlying assumption of which of these we sort of believe, right? That ethnocentric perspective of which one we believe to be the default. And so when you already believe that one of those is the default, as you interact with people from other time orientations, it can cause a lot of conflict. So I think, yep. So here are some of the cultural perceptions that we may have if we're in a different time orientation. Okay. So if I am in a present-oriented culture and I'm working with someone who's in a past-oriented culture, we often feel that they are too tied to tradition, right? They're not willing to change, even if there are better practices available, okay? A person who's oriented in the present may have a view of someone who's oriented in the future as that they're some sort of passionless slave to efficiency and materialism, right? They're always trying to get more. They're always hoping that something's going to be better in the future, okay? And people who view the future as sort of more important, when they're with people who are viewing the present as most important, we often view them as kind of self-centered. Okay? So we have this sort of ethnocentrism, right, that we all have for different things. When that happens with our cultural perceptions of time, then it can be kind of a conflict as we're interacting with other people in terms of our communication. Okay, some other nonverbal codes. We've talked about the fillers. We also have things like chemical. Okay, so the way that we kind of smell, or the way that we may smell because of the food that we eat, or the things that we're cooking in our house, those types of smells can indicate things about us, right? It can tell us some things about our background, and that can communicate information to someone whether we intend it to or not. Okay, we also have things that can happen with our skin. So we can blush, right, when we embarrass someone. You can have what they call goosebumps, or in some cultures they call that like chicken skin, where when something sort of either sort of touches you or, I don't know, kind of gives you chills or something that might happen. Those types of things are especially important in high context cultures, where the contextual clues are as important or more important than the verbal cues that people are giving. Okay. Also, some of our physical things, so things about what we think of as beautiful, or what things we think of as sort of important for our skin or our age. All of that stuff is very cultural, but also can tell us some things about us, right? So someone might be very, very fit, and so you can tell that they work out all the time. That carries some information about that person. Okay. Also things that people have, like the makeup that they use and wear, their clothing, the jewelry, those types of things all can indicate different things about you, and can communicate that in a nonverbal way. Okay. So nonverbal codes are learned from birth. Okay. And they're coordinated appropriately in speech and when listening. So we are kind of like these little sponges when we're little, and we're absorbing not just the words that people are using or the sounds that they're using, but also all of the information in terms of how they carry themselves or how they sit or what's appropriate. So an example is Japanese bowing. So it depends on the status of the participants. The inferior begins the bow, the superior decides when it's over. If both are equal, then both bows must begin and end simultaneously. Okay, this is a quote that comes out of a book that I sometimes use. This book is very interesting and talks about a lot of business practices, but this quote is given this way. So Whenever an American tries to bow to me, I often feel extremely awkward and uncomfortable because I simply cannot synchronize bowing with him or her. Both must know when to start, how deep and how long to stay in bowed position, and when to bring heads up. And this is something that when I watch is kind of painful, actually, to watch people who are not Japanese try to bow with someone who is Japanese, because it's sort of like having an accent. You just can't get it exactly the same as the native speaker. Even though you're trying very hard, it can take a long, long time to understand those types of nonverbal codes. Okay? So the rules, the rules and norms governing nonverbal communication are culture specific and outside of our conscious awareness, right? We're not thinking about them or talking about them all the time. And even when I'm teaching like English language, I don't really teach people what to do with their faces or their hands or anything with that. I'm just teaching them the words themselves. Okay, we learn them in childhood, and usually we have not heard them articulated verbally. The only example I can think of is that are articulated is usually a negative. So something like "don't point," and those types of things we might have articulated. Sometimes the only way to find out about Sometimes the only way to find out about the cultural norm is to break it. I'm so sorry. Inaccurate judgments of misused nonverbal communication are common, but they're hard to recognize. So when we have an incident where something happens and we misinterpret the information, we rarely get that information corrected because one, we don't have an idea that it's not correct, and two, the other person doesn't have an idea that our interpretation is not correct. So instead, we continue this belief of what we think it means or what we think we saw, and it can create stereotypes and continue that way. Okay? So how do we improve our intercultural competence? Well, the first thing is that we have to use our knowledge of our nonverbal behavior to notice, interpret, and use it accurately. Okay? So how do we react to differences? So I have a huge reaction to differences in spacing. I am someone who needs a large personal space bubble, and when someone is inside my space bubble, I feel it very quickly and very strongly. So I have this way that when I feel those sort of intense feelings, that I realize I have to monitor kind of what's going on and what's making me uncomfortable, to try to then see like what's going on in the situation. Okay. You observe tendencies. So you're watching what it is that people are doing. How do they gesture? How do they move and touch? And how do they interact with other people? Okay. And when we're making these interpretations, you have to really be very tentative. So treat it as a working hypothesis. Like, it seems like this might be what it is that I'm seeing. But you also want to kind of be flexible, because if you assume that what you're seeing is the exact thing you're interpreting, like, I know that what I'm seeing means this, then when you're wrong, you often don't correct that feeling. So you want to kind of be tentative with what these things might mean. And then you're looking for exceptions, right? So your experience might be the exception. And you've got to kind of look around and see what's going on. So look at the gender, the age of the participants, to kind of make some evaluations. And then you can always ask people that you're interacting with. The tricky thing is when you ask someone, it's very hard sometimes for them to acknowledge or understand exactly what's going on too. So something like, if I ask someone like, why do you move your hands in this way? They might just say, well, because that's what I'm supposed to do, or because that's just what I do. You don't always have a good explanation. So it's hard sometimes to get an explanation. Okay? So practicing observing these things is really one of the best ways to kind of continue your expansion of knowledge.